She entered the room in her impeccable uniform, freshly polished boots, her badge still smelling new, and with a courage that overflowed her chest. But as soon as she walked through the door, she realized this was no neutral place. The eyes that turned to her didn't hide their judgment. It was as if each one was silently saying she didn't belong there. Contained smiles, disguised whispers, expressions of contempt masked by formality. "Another one chosen by quota," someone murmured without moving their lips. She felt it, she understood, and kept it. Because she knew that in that environment, merit wasn't something handed to you, it was something you earned, with sweat, with pain, and sometimes with blood. She had prepared herself. Years of training, above-average evaluations, tactical awareness beyond expectations. But none of that seemed to matter when faced with the statistics many used as an excuse to invalidate her presence. To them, she was a number, a social experiment, a political ploy. It was easier to believe that than to accept that a woman, young, determined, and of humble origins, could through true merit achieve that position of auxiliary command. But fate, or perhaps something greater than that, would teach that base a lesson no military manual had ever dared to write. In the early days, she was treated like dead weight. No matter her background, her ideas, or her observations, everything was dismissed as over-enthusiasm, as if it were just a phase. She knew there was no point in arguing. Not here. Not like that. So she decided to observe, silently, every detail, every movement, every flaw that went unnoticed by the others. And it was there, in this forced silence, that she began to notice something the others ignored. The base's radar was showing signs of instability. Small lapses, fluctuations that no one took seriously. But she did, and recorded them. She said nothing. Not yet. Because she'd learned that in certain environments, respect isn't earned with arguments. It's imposed with actions at the right moment. She waited, like a silent lioness in the midst of a forest of sleeping predators. And then the moment arrived. It was dawn. The base was plunged into a heavy silence. The sky was clear, but the feeling in the air was dense, almost as if something was about to collapse, hovering above everyone. And it did. The central radar went down. Communications were cut. A plane on a classified mission vanished from control. The base collapsed. Discordant orders, shouts echoed through the corridors, officers bawling their heads, unsure where to look. The technology had failed. And fear set in. It was at that moment that she stood up. Without raising her voice, without asking permission, she simply pointed to a coordinate on the map and said firmly, "If he attempted an emergency landing, it was here." Everyone looked at her as if she'd committed blasphemy. A captain laughed disdainfully. A general pursed his lips. But someone, on impulse or desperation, decided to comply. And the search was sent. The following hours would change the fate of that base. If you're feeling the weight of silent judgment, if you've ever been placed in a position where everyone expected you to fail, then you need to keep watching. Because this story isn't just about a woman on a military base. It's about everyone who has ever been underestimated, overlooked or reduced to a number. It's about the instinct that no one values, but that ultimately saves lives. It's about you. If this beginning resonated with you, like this video now and subscribe to the channel, because what follows will make you rethink the value of silence, intuition, and resistance. This story is true, and how it ends could change the way you approach your own battles. And now, with the whole truth about to be revealed, I want you to comment below. My instinct is also valid. If you've ever felt like no one believed in you, but you still kept going, your experience matters, your instincts matter. And maybe, like her, you're one step closer to proving it to the world. It was on her very first day that she understood the price of being seen as the quota. No direct words were spoken, but the eyes spoke volumes. Some looked away, others analyzed with disdain. Smirks, the kind that mock silently but hurt like a slap. Another one to fill the statistic, someone muttered in the hallway, not daring to face her. She felt it. He swallowed hard, took a deep breath, and kept his chin up. Because there, within those cold walls of concrete and protocol, there was no room for weakness. Respect wasn't earned with a resume. It was earned with sweat, blood, and silence. At that base, those who didn't assert themselves were crushed. And she knew it. She was a woman. She was young, she was seen as an exception. The prejudice was disguised as a joke, but she had already learned that a joke is only funny when everyone laughs. And no one there wanted to laugh with her. Only at her. In the locker room, voices lowered as she entered. The sergeants made a point of ignoring her greeting. Her colleagues made comments they didn't dare say in front of her, but let slip enough for the message to be understood. She knew she wasn't welcome. Not yet. But she wasn't here to please. She'd come for a greater purpose, and that purpose was summed up in a phrase she repeated mentally with every step. They don't want to see me here. But I didn't come for them. It was the only certainty that fueled her muscles and nerves. The first group physical training session seemed like an ambush disguised as a routine. The obstacle course required strength, speed, and above all, a cool head. One soldier slipped on the rope, another got stuck in the mud. When her turn came, everyone stopped, some surreptitiously, others brazenly. They wanted to see her fail. She knew it, and yet she didn't hesitate. The cold bit her skin. The instructor's shouts gave her no respite, but she kept going. When she climbed the steep wall and threw herself over the top unaided, a murmur of surprise ran through the row of spectators. She rolled down the other side, stood up covered in mud, her eyes burning with focus, and didn't look at anyone. But she felt it. This was the beginning. It wasn't admiration. Yet. It was the discomfort of someone who saw something they hadn't expected. In the following days, the tests increased. What was the norm for others was doubled for her. Shots with extra weight, races with a tighter timer, mock missions where, mysteriously, her equipment would malfunction. And yet, she continued, without complaining, without lowering her head. While the others sank into the repetition of orders, she began to notice what no one else saw. A sergeant always touched his holster before shouting. A recruit fiddled with his watch before cheating. An officer looked away just before announcing shift changes. She saw the patterns. She sensed the details. She noticed what no one else there seemed to notice. It was the instinct born of silence and vigilance. During a nighttime simulation, something unexpected happened. One of the corporals disappeared from the team during deployment. Communication failed. Protocol required returning to base and reporting. But something in her told her otherwise. There was a faint shuffling in the brush, a muffled sound of breathing where no one should have been. While everyone retreated, she advanced, and found the corporal lying unconscious, his leg pinned under a tree trunk. She improvised a lever with her rifle, and saved the man before the medical team arrived. No one understood how she knew where to look. Neither did she. She just felt it. It was the same instinct she'd had since childhood. The feeling that the invisible could also speak, as long as the surrounding noise was silenced. Gradually, some began to view her differently, but most still resisted. After all, it wasn't just about being good. It was about not belonging to the logic of that system. A woman with precision and a good sense of place was uncomfortable because it broke the hierarchy of custom. And there, breaking implicit rules was more offensive than missing a target. It was on a cold morning that the division became clear. While everyone laughed at a video on a superior's cell phone, she looked at the map on the wall. She saw a marked route that no one commented on. She also saw that the fuel supplies were misaligned with the planned route. It made no sense. But when she questioned it, silence fell like a stone. After that, the looks grew heavy again. Now it wasn't just the quota. It was that she saw too much. And that in that environment could cost her dearly. Anger built inside, but she learned to channel it. Instead of screaming, she ran harder. Instead of complaining, she trained twice as hard. Instead of playing the victim, she became an expert in silence. Because she understood early on that true power lies in those who can listen without being heard, observe without being noticed, act without being predicted. And that's what she became. A silent threat, and even they didn't know it yet. Comment hook. Have you ever felt like you had to fight twice as hard just to be accepted? Comment here. I saw beyond what they showed me, if this story touched you. She'd always had an almost uneasy feeling, as if she lived in constant vigil between the silence of the machines and the whispers of the invisible. He was the kind of person who didn't accept ready-made answers, nor did he delegate his intuition to reports or safety statistics. Behind the impeccable uniform, the technical glasses and the steady voice on the radio, lay a mind that refused to be numbed by military routine, and that was precisely what saved lives that week. The mission seemed ordinary, the route standardized, the protocol tested hundreds of times, but something about that frequency, that subtle shift, screamed louder than any alarm. In the tower, the radar flickered with slight fluctuations, nothing the system flagged as serious, but she noticed. While others trusted the software's assurances, she noticed the hesitant tone in the data. The curvature of Flight 7V91's route was slightly off, almost imperceptible, but her trained mind didn't forgive patterns that defy logic. The plane had adjusted 0.7 degrees to the southwest, which in the middle of a mission flight could represent a difference of tens of kilometers, and no one seemed to see it as anything more than a slight weather variation. She didn't question aloud. She preferred to observe. Sitting in the corner of the control room, her eyes fixed on the data, she discreetly scribbled a sequence in her notebook. She had a habit of writing down anything that deviated from the norm, even if she later discovered it was an error in interpretation. But this time it wasn't. There was a pattern. A second plane, 2 hours later, made exactly the same adjustment. And on the radar, a brief interference, as if something were cutting or distorting the signal at a specific altitude. She circled the dot on the paper. She replaced silence with double attention. No one else saw it, and that bothered her. The operation commander, confident and experienced, dismissed any possibility of anomaly. It could be atmospheric reflection. That's common at this time of year. She heard it, but didn't believe it, because it wasn't just the radar. It was the wind. It was the co-pilot's response time. It was the slight change in the pilot's tone of voice when he reported automatic course adjustment. It was as if everyone was asleep, relying too much on the machines, while she sensed that something, somewhere, was trying to warn them. Only no one listens to the silence when it screams from within. 3 nights before the accident, she dreamed about the fall. Not a literal dream, with cliched images of explosions or screams, but a feeling of a slow descent, of disorientation, as if everything were being driven to a point of no return. She woke in a cold sweat, but she didn't tell anyone. Not because she didn't believe in herself, but because in that environment, dreams have no credibility. Only statistics, only data. The day before the mission, she returned to the radar. Again, the oscillation. Again, frequency 17,445, emitting a low, almost imperceptible noise. She called the maintenance technician. "Everything is as expected," he said, reading the automated report. She wanted to scream, but she held back. She grabbed her notebook, scribbled the third turn, the third route change, and there, in that unassuming scribble, she saw what no one else saw. All the variations pointed in the same direction. A blind spot in the system. A silent error. A digital trap. She went to the previous mission's database. She manually compared every track, every climb, every automatic adjustment, and she realized the planes were following interference, as if an invisible magnetic field was distorting navigation from a precise altitude, in a precise area. It was the edge of the map that no one monitored so closely because nothing ever happened there. Precisely the kind of belief that costs dearly when the improbable decides to act. On the day of the accident, she tried to speak, but it was too late. The orders had already been given. The mission was underway. She watched the radar as the dots followed their paths, until the dot disappeared. No explosion, no alarm, just silence. A void. As if the system was erasing data that refused to obey. And in that instant, what she wrote in her notebook made too much sense to be coincidence. She got up from her chair. She ran to the monitoring room. She screamed. But it was too late. Because when the pattern repeats itself and no one listens, fate becomes the consequence of neglect. And perhaps most disturbing of all is knowing that she noticed, she saw, she felt, but she was ignored. Because in systems dominated by confident voices and machines that feign absolute precision, human instinct is the first to be discredited. What would you do if you saw the error before everyone else, and no one listened? Now tell me, have you ever ignored a hunch? And then it was too late. Comment below and share that moment when your sixth sense tried to warn you, but the world told you to shut up. The day began like any other, with the almost arrogant precision of an airbase that prides itself on never failing. The clocks were synchronized, communications flowing with the coolness of a system trained for war and shaped by discipline. But there are days when the universe, without warning, throws everything to the ground just to see who gets up. At 2:02 p.m., a subtle noise crossed the control room's headsets. It sounded like harmless interference, like a misplaced breath. No one moved. At 2:03 p.m., the radar blinked. For a second, maybe two. Then it came back on. Someone commented that it was just a weather fluctuation, just another day. Except it wasn't. This was the beginning of the collapse. At 2:05 p.m., the screen went completely dark. The server's power went out. The system went dark, as if it had been ripped from the world. It was the kind of silence that brings no peace. It was the kind of darkness that swallows the breath of the strong. A total blackout. There was no plan B. No simulation had been prepared for this. Voices overlapped, commands were lost, chaos began to take shape as the now blind control center struggled to locate itself in a technological void. But amid the engineer's desperation and the commander's voice breaking through radio protocols, it didn't panic. She stood up slowly, unhurriedly. Her eyes seemed to see through the confusion. He closed them for 3 seconds and just listened. The sound of the wind outside, the direction it blew, the cadence that changed with the gusts. It was as if the air was telling him something the machine had forgotten. Instinct, dormant in so many theoretical courses and assessment forms, awakened with the silent fury of someone who knows they only live once, and that it's in these moments that we measure who is merely uniform, and who was born to be there. While the others shouted numbers and kicked cables, she ignored the chaos. Eyes still closed, she walked to the secondary table where, by protocol, no one else trusted her. She turned on the analog radio, turned the frequency knob, silence, more silence, then a rhythmic pulse, a distant yet present noise. It wasn't a voice, but a signal, and that was enough for someone who knew how to read the invisible. She mentally noted the beats, converted the frequency based on previous patterns, and reinterpreted the approximate positioning of the aircraft on the mission. It was a calculation of faith, but also of courage, because those who expect everything ready never understand what it means to improvise responsibly. At 2:09 p.m., she turned to the control desk and gave a curt, almost rude order. Correct the north axis. The aircraft changed course on their own. It's automatic protocol. If you don't recalibrate now, they'll cross paths in the same air corridor. No one responded immediately. A disbelieving silence fell. How do you know that? They asked. She didn't answer. She simply turned her eyes to the sky, as if listening to the world more accurately than any radar. The second of hesitation was broken by a new siren. 2 aircraft were about to enter a collision zone. What she had said, with the precision of someone who doesn't doubt herself. It was only then that they realized it wasn't luck. It was preparation. It was presence. While the system failed, she was the system. While technology was silent, she spoke. And she didn't need to raise her voice to be heard. The entire room fell silent, not out of respect, but out of shame. Because everyone who had previously mocked her extrasensory training, her extra hours of study, her irritating habit of writing down weather patterns by hand, now looked at her as if she were on another level, because she was, and always had been. They just didn't want to see it. At 2:13 p.m., the systems began to reboot. The screen returned. The panic didn't. She had already done the job the machine should have done. An aircraft that was seconds away from crossing the collision line had already altered course on her orders, without hesitation, without approval, but with results. The captain approached with slow steps. "How did you know?" he asked. she replied in a firm voice, without pride but without forced humility. Because I've learned to hear what others ignore. When the screen goes blank, the wind speaks. That was the day the radar went down. And, ironically, it was the day she became the only reliable radar in that place, the kind of professional who doesn't wait for approval to act, who doesn't need validation to be brilliant, who understands that true value isn't in being seen, but in being indispensable when no one else knows what to do. Because some people need a manual, and then there are those who, they are the manual when the system fails. And now tell me, in a blackout like that, what type would you be? Her gaze pierced the silence of the room. No doubt, no hesitation. She knew. The map spread out on the metal table reflected the tension in the air, but her hand pointed firmly. There's a valley. If the pilot attempted an emergency landing, it was there. The general remained motionless for a few seconds, his arms crossed like iron walls. His eyes, experienced and skeptical, didn't hide his judgment. Around them, whispers began. A superior leaned in, with a crooked smile that said it all. She's no expert. And there was the moment. The sentence that would drive anyone to the wall. But she didn't back down. Not for a second. With the same calmness of someone who has had to shout louder to be heard in rooms that didn't belong to her, she responded with something few have the audacity to maintain before the hierarchy. But I'm right. The room transforms. There's no fanfare. But discomfort hangs like a thick cloud. No one wants to be the first to agree, and above all, no one wants to be the first to object. The general's silence weighs heavily. He observes, analyzes, weighs the risks. Time has run out for traditional tactics. The standard search has yielded nothing. And faced with imminent failure, protocol gives way to what would previously have been considered almost an affront, the boldness of intuition. The decision to authorize the mission to the valley wasn't made out of faith in her. It was pressure. It was desperation disguised as strategy, a last resort that no one wanted to officially declare, but which at that moment was all that remained. And it's precisely in these moments that true leaders reveal themselves. They're not those with rank. They're those with courage, the courage to back up their own name when everyone doubts it, the courage to point out the improbable and say, "This is it." And above all, the courage to not tremble at the laughter, disguised as scorn that always appears when someone dares to step out of line. She knew that if she were wrong, she would be buried in silence. No official report would mention her name, no public recognition, just another on the list of those who tried to help. But if she were right, and she knew she was, nothing would ever be the same again. Because there are moments in life when the courage of a single gesture dismantles decades of imposed silence. And this was one of those moments. It wasn't about the valley, it wasn't about the map, it was about her. About all the times her voice was silenced for not being qualified enough. About every meeting where her opinion was recorded but never considered. About every collective victory where her contribution was diluted in anonymity. The helicopter hovered over the indicated point. The valley, previously ignored, loomed like an open wound in the terrain. From above, nothing seemed out of the ordinary, but she couldn't take her eyes off the thermal imager flashing on the monitor screen. A blur of heat, small, unsteady. But there. She leaned forward and pointed. There, behind the rise. The operator hesitated. The commander hesitated. But she didn't. And once again, the order came reluctantly. The aircraft descended. And what they found wasn't just wreckage. It was a sign of life, faint but present. Rescue is immediate. The medical team springs into action. Communication explodes into code. The operations center becomes a war of sounds. But inside her, all is at peace. Not because of recognition, not because of glory, but because of the confirmation of something the world tries to erase daily. Intuition doesn't need a diploma. Competence doesn't need the approval of a packed room. And truth doesn't depend on who repeats it loudest. She proved it. With precision, with firmness, with what few would have kept intact in that environment. Courage. Upon returning, faces changed. The general didn't apologize, But the look, once hard, was now respectful. The superior who had doubted remained silent. And the final report, even with its cold, objective words, couldn't hide the obvious. Without her decision, there would have been no survivors. But what impacted her most wasn't the rescue. It was what came after. The meetings began to change. The questions began to come directly to her. The subtexts that had previously despised her now fell silent, and for the first time, she felt she had broken something bigger than protocol. She had shattered an entire structure of contempt disguised as formality. The mission was over. The pilot survived. The families were notified. The press reported a daring maneuver at the last moment. But those who lived there know. The boldness was hers. The choice not to remain silent. Not to ask permission. Not to wait for the hierarchy to accept. Because some people don't wait to be called. Some people stand up and act. And it's at this point that history divides between those who watch and those who make things happen. Comment here. Are you the type who waits for permission, or are you the type who stands up and points out the valley? The helicopter flew low, tense, silent, as if respecting the invisible weight of responsibility it carried. Inside, the crew was barely breathing. Each member, previously accustomed to the cold procedures, now observed the terrain with almost human eyes, searching for a needle in a haystack of mud, trees, and suspicion. But it wasn't just any coordinate. It was as coordinates. Hers. The one many tried to sabotage. The one they listened to out of obligation, not respect. Only now, at the limit of the mission, it was her intuition that guided them, and no aeronautical manual could compete with that. From above, the pilot spotted something. A strange glint beneath the torn treetops. Metal. The sunlight caught the crooked reflection of a fuselage that shouldn't have been there. The co-pilot's eyes widened, and before another word could be spoken, the radio blared. Confirmed. Metallic object sighted. Area consistent with target location. Everyone's heart raced. And amid the tension, a subtle silence fell. She was right. Again. The helicopter hovered in the air. The cables descended. The team touched down with almost choreographed precision. The smell of burning kerosene mixed with damp foliage betrayed that the place was still alive. One of the soldiers shouted, "Over here! There's something here!" Everyone ran. The sound of footsteps in the woods mingled with the blare of radios, the snapping of branches, and the heavy breathing of those who didn't know what they were about to find, but already sensed it would be big. Twisted metal, impact marks, open suitcases, scattered papers. Everything indicated the plane had crashed there, but it was one detail that froze everyone for a moment. A faint, muffled sound, almost like a sob. And then another scream. This time coming from inside the fuselage. "You have survivors." Protocol was ignored. They ran as if it were a personal rescue. One by one, the injured bodies were located, and all alive, exhausted, dehydrated, bruised, but alive. The team doctor, experienced and cool, removed her glasses, overcome with emotion. If they had arrived a day later... At the base, the general listened to the confirmation message with his jaw clenched. The silence among the officers said more than any words. They doubted, they scoffed, they called a hunch what was cold data reading, emotional analysis of forgotten signals, perception beyond the radar. But she insisted. She didn't shout. She didn't argue. She simply marked it on the map, looked her superior in the eye and said, "It was there." And it was. When she stepped off the helicopter back to base, the scene was almost cinematic. Covered in dirt, her uniform torn, but her gaze intact. No one applauded, no one praised, but everyone made way. And that in that place was worth more than medals. She wasn't a selfie heroine. She was the one who delivered what no one could, because she heard what no one wanted to hear. Her instinct, her breaking the mold, her courage to embrace what seemed illogical. Whispers began in the hallways. Those who had previously called her an exaggeration now repeated her phrases as if they were their own. Those who doubted her now tried to associate their names with the successful mission, but she, silent. She just took notes, as she always had, Because she knew that the encounter with the plane wasn't just about recovering bodies, it was about redeeming her own credibility. And she wasn't going to waste it seeking approval from those who lacked the courage to back anything without a group behind them. In the control room, she crossed her arms as she watched the replay of the flyby, not out of vanity, but because she wanted to understand every detail. It's not enough to get it right. You have to know because you got it right. The difference between luck and excellence lies in the ability to repeat the same thing, even under pressure. And she was ready. Because those who were once ignored learn to work with precision. Every coordinate, every accurate guess, every validated instinct was now an invisible scar of prestige, and those who have this don't need to shout. Just mark it on the map and wait for others to follow. Now tell me, have you ever been discredited like this and then proven right? Or are you still at the stage where people doubt your vision? Write in the comments, are you one of those who follow the map? Or one of those who chart the path? When the command room door closed behind the general, the metallic sound of the latch echoed like a sentence. The sergeants stopped talking. The operators froze mid-command. The analysts looked away from their screens. The silence wasn't empty. It was dense, charged with everything no one could name. For the first time in days, the environment that had previously teemed with codes, coordinates, and emergencies was completely still. And it wasn't fear. It was respect. Respect for something that had been said, done, proven, and that until minutes ago had only been discredited. She entered. She didn't ask permission, she didn't hesitate. Her step was firm, but not arrogant. Her body was rigid, as if she'd endured more than one tense night. Her eyes were dry. Her mind was alert. But most striking was the silence around her. The same silence that had isolated her at the beginning of the mission now enveloped her reverently. No one dared interrupt. The general merely nodded slightly, as if acknowledging something greater than orders or ranks, and everyone else followed suit. One by one, the eyes that had once judged her now avoided direct contact, as if the truth were too intense to face head-on. She didn't smile. The moment didn't call for celebration. She simply took a deep breath, as if releasing the weight of 20 decisions no one had the courage to make. And in that breath, there was much more than relief. There was a silent message. She no longer needed to prove anything, because in a base where every look was a judgment, every command a power struggle, and every failure a final sentence, she had done the unthinkable. She listened where no one wanted to. She saw where everyone was blind, and above all, she persisted when everyone tried to silence her. The data was still being processed. Aerial images showed the wreckage. The rescue helicopter continued with the first survivors. But there, at that specific moment, none of that was more important than what had transpired in the collective consciousness of that team. They knew. They saw. They were there when the intuition they laughed at became a map, when the discredited hunch became the exact coordinates, when her plan B saved lives that protocol would have condemned. It wasn't her words that convinced them. It was the result. It was the twisted metal in the exact spot where she insisted. It was the survivor's cry saying that was close. It was the echo of truth trampling over hierarchy with the force of someone who didn't ask permission to be right. And the most intriguing thing was, she wasn't seeking recognition. She never had. Her gaze wasn't seeking applause, it was seeking clarity. She wanted someone to say, "You were right all along." But she knew that kind of statement was heavier than an apology. Because acknowledging this would require an uncomfortable dive into their own insecurities, admitting they were wrong to doubt, that they turned their faces away when she spoke, that they tried to minimize her not through logic, but through fear of losing their own ground. And there she was, intact, after a storm of sidelong glances and whispered comments. Intact, but transformed. Because being validated after so much wear and tear isn't a reward, it's reparation. The general clenched his fists at his sides. It wasn't a gesture of tension, but of restraint. He knew any word spoken at that moment would sound weak. He knew her stance placed him in debt, and emotional debt is the most expensive debt within a military base, because it affects pride, reputation, the fragile notion of control. That's why he chose silence, not out of weakness, but out of wisdom. Perhaps on another day he would call her to talk. Perhaps he would try to make up for it with a promotion, a medal, a catchphrase. But now he knew no symbol would carry the weight of that breath she released as she entered the room. The operators returned slowly to their consoles, but not as quickly. Each one remained silent, mentally reviewing where they had doubted. The sergeants looked at each other, complicit in a shared shame, and the command room itself seemed different. As if that small space now held a history no one would dare rewrite. The air, once technical and predictable, was now charged with something ancient, a kind of collective recognition that transcends organizational charts, the kind of respect that only arises after silent humiliation, from solitary persistence, from an impossible result that becomes indisputable. She remained standing for a few more seconds. She watched the monitors. She saw the coordinates being crossed again. She knew the mission wasn't over yet. But what she did in that room in silence was greater than any search. She turned the code of conduct inside out and forced everyone to rewrite their beliefs about command, competence, and courage. Because deep down, everyone there understood that there's a strength that can't be taught in academies, an instinct that can't be calculated by spreadsheets, and a courage that doesn't require shouting. Just enter in silence and breathe. Now tell me, have you ever experienced something similar? When did you have to silence the world to prove your intuition was right? Tell me in the comments. Maybe your story will inspire someone else to never give up on listening to their own voice. She was only 9 years old when she learned to walk silently, stepping where her father did, imitating his lightness as he touched the ground, as if carrying a secret. The brush closed around her, but she saw through it. "You need to hear what's not said," he said, without turning his face, sniffing out the invisible. The girl with attentive eyes absorbed everything without speaking, because words are noisy, and the best tracks live in silence. She grew up among subtle footprints and the smell of turned earth. She grew up recognizing when the forest was too quiet, when birds stopped singing, when nature hesitated. She grew up hearing the unspoken. It wasn't just instinct. It was training, it was inheritance. It was a fine-tuning of senses that most humans lose before the age of 12. At the barracks, no one understood how she knew. No formulas or calculations came from her. She pointed, and it was right. Someone said it was luck. Another scoffed. "She feels it in the air like an Indian." She listened and ignored it. Not because she was humble, but because she didn't have time to explain herself. When the radar went down and the control center went black, she was the one who said, "The wind is changing." They weren't in an open field, but she felt it. Humidity, pressure, a discrete, low-frequency noise, something the sensors couldn't detect, but which she'd recognized since she was a girl from when her father said, "When the silence changes, the danger moves." And that day, the silence had changed. On the search mission, while everyone discussed maps and possible routes, she fell silent. She stretched out her arm and pointed to a valley no one was betting on. "There." The general frowned. "Are you sure?" She didn't answer, because deep down, certainty didn't matter. What mattered was the call of her nose. What mattered was the sensory memory she carried like an internal tattoo. It didn't come from reports, it came from smelling the damp grass when her father stopped in the middle of the trail and whispered, "Someone's watching us." And there was. There always was. A hunter, an animal, a danger the others ignored. But not her. She had become heir to an unwritten code. Scenes from her childhood flashed by under the pressure of helicopters and the sound of failing radios. She saw herself as a small child, watching her father crouched, touching the earth. He didn't say, "Look," he said, "Listen with your eyes." She learned to listen with her eyes, to feel with her skin, to interpret the pause of the crickets, the delay of the cicadas, the cold current in the middle of the hot forest. In the military, this translated into premonition, but it was technique, an ancestral technique. She carried in her blood what wasn't taught in academies. Aboard the helicopter, as they flew over empty spaces, she closed her eyes for 3 seconds. The pilot asked, "What are you doing?" She simply replied, "The listening is louder than the noise." She pointed again. A dip in the terrain, a distortion in the shadows, something reminiscent of what her father called a forest wound. And there was the plane, down, torn but alive, with survivors. And no one in command had the courage to ask how she knew. Not after that. There was something intimidating in her eyes. A kind of conviction only those who have come face to face with the invisible possess. She didn't need to prove anything. Time proved it for her. The base began calling her the instinctive one, half in a tone of respect, half in a tone of amazement. But her father, if he were alive, would simply say, she only heard what no one else wanted to hear. Because her instinct wasn't magic, it was the result of years spent walking among animals, trees, and omens. While others studied maps, she read the wind's behavior. While others waited for data, she interpreted the gaps in sound. And all this reading was condensed into that watchful, restless gaze, which seemed always sniffing out the world's next move. Because she knew the world warns before it falls. It always warns. But most people are too busy listening to their own echo, not her. She waited for the signal, and when it came, even if it was a whisper among silent trees, she acted. Because she knew. Now I want to know from you. At what point in your life did you ignore a silence that deep down was warning you? Comment here. I want to understand how far your instincts go. The promotion came without announcement, without celebration, without cheesy speeches or forced applause. No banner hung in the base hallway, no toast in the mess hall, or official photo with a handshake from the commander. And this, for her, was the closest thing to justice the military system could offer. It wasn't a prize. It wasn't a treat nor a kindness. It was a course adjustment, a silent recognition for what only attentive eyes could capture. The kind of merit that doesn't depend on who applauds, but on what was done when no one was willing to act. While many there were still discussing reports, she was in the woods, amidst the smoke and the risk, listening to sounds no radar could pick up. And now her name was engraved, not in a newspaper headline but on something more symbolic. The base's mural, that space where only those who have left a real mark earn a place. The promotion ceremony was administrative. Paperwork signed, registration completed, position changed. No new uniform, no acceptance speech. She declined the interview her advisor suggested. She declined the prepared text for the internal newsletter. I don't need that, she replied calmly. Those who need to know already know, and she did. The general who had previously doubted her now avoided holding her gaze for too long. The officers who questioned her intuition began to watch her movements with an almost uncomfortable attention. There was something in her posture that needed no justification, a kind of authority that doesn't shout, just imposes itself. Whispers began to circulate in the base's corridors. Veterans chatted among themselves, trying to understand how this cadet, the quota as some initially called her, had become such a role model. She didn't participate in social circles, didn't seek to please her superiors, and didn't display superiority over her subordinates. She was a presence, that's all. But presence in environments where everyone competes for noise is the kind of power that scares the most. The base's bulletin board was simple. A brushed steel plaque engraved with names arranged in rows by mission and date. It wasn't illuminated, so it didn't attract the attention of hurried passers-by. But every new cadet was taken to it during their first week, like a silent initiation ritual. The instructors pointed out names and told stories, some filled with bravery, others with sacrifice. There were even exaggerated legends. And now there, in the lower right corner, was her name. No title, no grandiose description. Just her name, the mission date, and a dry note. Decisive action in rescue operation. The next morning, a newly arrived cadet stopped in front of the bulletin board. Young, with a curious look, notebook in hand, she scanned the names carefully. When she saw hers, she frowned and asked the sergeant next to her, "Who was that?" The sergeant took 2 seconds before answering. Not because he didn't know, but because he was searching for the exact words. She was the one who heard what no one wanted to hear. The answer sounded almost like a riddle, but those with trained ears understood that there was more to that sentence than any resume could contain. Meanwhile, she walked through the training ground as always, discreet, focused, almost invisible. But her every step seemed to echo louder now, not out of vanity, but because of the contrast. Everyone was watching. The entire base knew what had happened, but few spoke openly. Perhaps out of wounded pride, perhaps out of disguised admiration. The fact was, when the radars failed, she was the one who had the courage to point out the impossible. When the protocols failed, she trusted what no manual taught. It was impossible not to notice that since her promotion, the tone of her orders had changed. Now, when she suggested something, few questioned it, not out of fear, but because they knew that to ignore that voice was to spurn a chance at survival. A new respect had been born. Not the respect forced by hierarchy, but the respect that only silent competence can command. Deep down, she knew that promotion wouldn't change anything for her. Her focus was elsewhere. She never wanted a position, she wanted results. But the difference was that now, with formal recognition, she would have more autonomy to act her way. And her way was simple: observe what others ignored, connect what no one saw, decide in silence, and act when others' hesitation became a threat. The military world, with all its codes of honor, rarely celebrates those who keep quiet. But she never wanted a party. Because I knew that true deeds don't need the spotlight, they just need to be done. And those who truly do things are never worried about being seen. You're too busy listening. The kind of listening that goes beyond sound. The listening of those who recognize the silence of danger before it screams. Now, while the entire system tried to recalculate its parameters in the face of this exception that became the rule, she stood firm. Because while many still studied maps, she trusted the compass she'd carried since childhood, intuition, and perhaps that's why her name on the wall carries more weight than many medals hanging in safes. Now tell me in the comments, are you the type who waits for recognition? Or the type who acts when no one else has the courage? When the applause dies down and the hubbub of the military base falls silent, a truth remains that echoes beyond the concrete walls, louder than any decoration or headline. The truth that sometimes what moves a person is not official recognition, but the silent certainty of having done the right thing when no one else had the courage to try. And this certainty, however invisible it may be to others, is what builds a legacy. A legacy that doesn't need to be spoken aloud to be felt. It pulses between the lines of history, in the changing gazes, in the voices that once doubted and now fall silent out of respect. She didn't seek status. She didn't wait for permission. What she carried wasn't a badge of authority. It was a conviction that grew in the shadow of others' doubts. It was shaped by silent comments, by suspicions disguised as technical advice, by barriers that were never spoken, but were always there. She overcame each of them with something you don't learn in courses or receive through promotion: instinct. The ability to sense what wasn't said, to see what others dismissed, to take a chance on what seemed absurd to everyone but her. Because inside her, something screamed, and she heard it. This kind of courage doesn't ask for permission. It acts. Even when the world revolves around formulas, hierarchies, and protocols, there are those who break logic with a simple yet impossible to ignore gesture. That's what she did. When the radar failed, she didn't. When the experts gave up, she persisted. When the system proved blind, she saw beyond. What drove this character wasn't arrogance, but an unshakable respect for what she felt. A faith so profound in her own discernment that not even the silence of command could erase it. And the most impressive thing is that she didn't demand credit. When the operation ended, when the survivors were located, when the base realized she was right, she didn't make a speech, she didn't pose for a photo, she didn't want an interview, she preferred silence. A silence that isn't empty but full of meaning, full of legitimate authority, the kind that doesn't need to be declared because it's already been earned. Her name engraved on the wall doesn't carry vanity, it carries history. It carries a message for those who come after, that a sure instinct is worth more than 1,000,000 empty theories. And it's at this point that everything changes. Because suddenly, the one who was seen as the outsider, the political bet, the newcomer without pedigree, becomes the example that redefines the standard. She didn't need to prove anything. She just had to act when no one else believed her. And that changes everything. It changes perception, it changes criteria, it changes the game. And most fascinatingly, it changes without fanfare. Without needing to confront, it transforms. Without needing to shout, it teaches. Without needing to justify itself, it inspires. Now perhaps you're there on the other side, remembering when you were underestimated, when you were doubted just because you were different. Maybe you were also called exaggerated, emotional, or outside the norm. Maybe you were excluded from meetings, ignored in decisions, overlooked for not having the ideal profile. But what this story proves is that it's not the profile that determines impact. It's the attitude. It's the keen listening. It's the step taken when everything tells you to stand still. It's instinct, the one that, if you trust, can take you where no one ever imagined you would go. And if until now you've held back your intuition to avoid appearing arrogant, hidden your perceptions, to avoid appearing strange, or suppressed your voice to avoid displeasing others, maybe it's time to change the game, to stop asking permission to feel. Because the world doesn't need more conformists, it needs people who feel, who act, who challenge the obvious and take risks for what's right. People like her, people like you. So, if this story touched you, leave a like right now. If you also believe that instinct is a force that transforms destinies, subscribe to the channel, because in the next video, you'll learn about the day the general himself had to apologize, and the reason will give you goosebumps. Comment below. My instincts are valid too. Let's show together that hearing what no one else hears is indeed a gift, and that this gift, when respected, changes everything.